It wasn't until the 19th century, under French colonial rule, that roads were opened in the Central Highlands. With the French came rubber plantations and the corvée, or forced labor, of Montagnards.
The South Vietnamese moved into what is now known as Vietnam out of mainland China a few hundred years ago. They mostly settled in the lowland areas, but eventually they coveted what the Montagnards had in the Central Highlands, and they began to move into the Central Highlands, taking property and generally messing with the Montagnards. There's been a lifelong antagonism that's existed for hundreds of years now between the Montagnards and the Vietnamese, both north and south. They don't like each other. The Montagnards do in fact like the Americans. They like the French before us, but they don't like the people that they have to live with, the Vietnamese. You might liken the Montagnards and the relationship that they have with the Vietnamese to what the Americans had with the American Indians in the last century.
So I would say in general that there was a prejudicial type of treatment overall that the Montagnards would suffer in general by the Vietnamese, their military and civilian.
The French were the first to colonize the Montagnard world. They wooed the Montagnards, and in return for their support, promises were made. Local autonomy was granted, and Montagnard laws were codified. Ho Chi Minh, however, wanted the French out of Vietnam, but France was not leaving without a fight. Both sides started recruiting Montagnards. The historical animosity between the Montagnards and the Vietnamese was exploited, and many Montagnards sided with the French. The war between the French and Viet Minh ended with the defeat of the French at a remote northern outpost called Dien Bien Phu. In 1954, the Geneva Conference ended the war and saw vast regions of land ceded to two new nations, North and South Vietnam. While the Central Highlands had never known Vietnamese rule, the ancient Montagnard world was handed over to the oppressive South Vietnamese regime. The Montagnard tribes responded with civil rights movements, such as Bajaraka.
Bajaraka was the first movement of Dega people. I would say began in 1956, when French turned over the government to Vietnam, and the Vietnamese start to annex the highland, Dega land, take all this good land and move all our village to the place that very hard to farming.
Their traditional cultural practices and farming methods were banned, as were their legal systems and the use and teaching of their languages. The Montagnards watched helplessly as they were forced from their ancestral villages. South Vietnam began the controversial Strategic Hamlet Program, where villages were forcibly removed to fortified camps to prevent increasing Viet Cong influence. Widely criticized, the relocations resulted in atrocities, as occurred in the village of Plei Bac in 1963.
In my village, the South Vietnamese government killed 65 of my people.
My father was one of the civil rights leader of the Dega people. For this, he was in jail for many years. The first one is from 1958 until 1962, and they released him from the prison. In 1965, they put him in prison again until 1969. And when the communists took over South Vietnam, they killed him in 1976. And I also have many uncles and older cousins that either been killed by the Vietnamese government or in prison. One of my uncle, because of his highly educated by the French, and he's very intellectual person, and also because of his involved in Christian, because he was director of Bible school. When the communists took over in 1975, they put him in jail for many, many years.
War between North and South Vietnam was looming, as was the deepening American role in Vietnam. The CIA had already begun recruiting and training Montagnards. Americans also assisted in civic action programs and relocations to keep communist influence out of the highlands. Unfortunately for the Montagnards, their world was in the middle of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the North Vietnamese army supply route. The communists began brutalizing Montagnards and attacking their villages.
Up in the northern part of my province, there was mainly Banat. Well, the Banat up there in the north was simply rounded up by the Viet Cong and used as slave labor.
With the South Vietnamese government persecuting Montagnards from the south and the communists attacking them from the north, the Montagnards were trapped.
In our culture, we have a saying for this. The cat is white, the cat is black. They both eat the mouse. We, the Montagnard people, were the mouse.
Within the Central Highlands at any one time during the active part of the war, there's probably about 40,000 Montagnards that were working with Special Forces at the various 8 camps. They also worked with the Mike Forces. The Mike Forces were battalion-sized units of Montagnards who were actually led by American Special Forces and tended to move throughout the 2-corps area. You had regional and popular forces, which were mostly village defense units, and they only stayed within the local unit. Your civilian irregular defense group units are also Montagnards, and they usually stayed within a local area.
I was seriously wounded while fighting with United States Army, 4th Infantry Division.
They're great in combat. That's the reason we used them. We knew that they would not run on you.
They kept the North Vietnamese off balance and out of the Central Highlands for many, many years. They were very good troops. We liked each other.
A great bond between the Montagnards and US soldiers also developed.
A dual love. We loved them, they loved us. And they saved a lot of American lives, you know, the Montagnards.
Most of the time that when I was in Vietnam, I worked for the U.S. Special Forces. I worked for Mike Force, I worked in the CIDG camp, and you know, but I travel a lot. While working for them, I also working for my people.
Kok Saw was sent to the United States for military training. Before he left, the president of the Montagnard National Movement entrusted him with a letter to Edward Kennedy. This was the last time the two men would see each other alive.